Billionaire CEO PANICS without a Chinese translator, until the black janitor takes over and the ballroom glittered with gold chandeliers, polished marble floors, and the smell of wealth. Powerful men in tailored suits circled around, waiting for the CEO's big international deal. Cameras flashed, investors whispered. This was supposed to be the night when millions, no billions, shifted hands. But then came the silence. The translator, the one man meant to bridge the language barrier between the CEO and the Chinese investors, was nowhere to be found. The billionaire CEO, who prided himself on control, suddenly felt powerless. He glanced around the room, his perfect smile cracking, sweat beading on his forehead. Whispers grew louder. The investors frowned, confused, insulted even. The CEO's empire stood on the edge of collapse, not because of markets or rivals, but because no one could speak the language, no one except the man no one in that room respected, a janitor. Black, invisible, sweeping the floor just a moment ago. And yet, his story was about to shatter every prejudice in that room. His name was Marcus, 45 years old, tall but tired in posture, the kind of man whose presence blended into the background even in the brightest of rooms. Every evening, when the skyscraper's lights dimmed and the executives went home to penthouses and luxury cars, Marcus arrived with his cart. He carried a mop, a bucket, a few rags, and the quiet dignity of a man who worked because he had to, not because he was ever respected for it. He pushed his mop across marble floors, polished to perfection, wiping away the footprints of men who never once looked him in the eye. They talked loudly as if he weren't there, tossed papers on the ground, left coffee stains on expensive furniture, and assumed someone like Marcus had no story worth knowing. But Marcus had once stood at the front of classrooms, chalk in hand, explaining the delicate art of language to students who hung on every word. He was a linguist, not just fluent in English, but in Spanish, French, Arabic, Mandarin, and Cantonese. He had devoted years to studying the music of language, the rhythm of culture, the way words carried entire histories within them. For a while, he lived a life filled with books, debates, travel, and purpose. He imagined his future was secure, his knowledge untouchable, until reality reminded him that skin color still dictated opportunity. After graduating at the top of his class, Marcus applied for jobs in universities, corporate firms, and translation companies. Time after time, he walked into interviews with his head held high and his resume shining. And time after time, the smiles at the table froze when he entered. Questions shifted from his skills to his background. Doors that seemed open slammed shut the moment they saw who he was. Sometimes they told him bluntly, "We're looking for a different kind of fit." Other times, they simply never called back. He watched less qualified candidates, some of whom had asked him for help in school, walk into positions he could only dream of. Bills piled up. His wife's health declined. His children grew hungry for stability. Pride doesn't fill stomachs, and degrees don't guarantee fairness. So Marcus took the jobs left over, the ones no one else wanted. He swept floors, scrubbed toilets, emptied trash bins, and made himself small in the presence of men who thought money made them important. He became invisible, but inside, the knowledge never left him. Every night as he wiped the glass doors of the high-rise, he could hear pieces of conversations in different languages. Businessmen strategizing in Mandarin, investors chatting in French, tourists visiting the lobby in Spanish. Marcus absorbed it all, silently translating in his mind, knowing he could have been sitting at those tables instead of cleaning under them. The investors shifted in their seats, their faces tight with irritation as the minutes dragged on. The air in the room grew heavier, charged with unspoken tension. They had flown thousands of miles to negotiate, expecting precision, respect, and efficiency, and instead they were greeted with chaos. Their words in Mandarin cut sharply through the silence, frustration spilling out in tones that made even the assistants nervous. One of them muttered that this meeting was a waste of time. Another leaned back, folding his arms, already planning his departure. In their culture, respect was shown not only in words but in preparation, and to arrive without a translator was not just inconvenient, it was insulting. The CEO, normally smooth and confident, was unraveling before their eyes. His practiced smile looked more like a grimace. He tried speaking broken English with forced emphasis, waving his hands as if gestures could replace understanding. The investors frowned deeper. His words collided into awkward fragments, and every attempt only emphasized the gap between them. He glanced toward his assistants, demanding solutions with his eyes, but they were just as helpless. Their frantic fingers scrolled through contact lists, searching for anyone at all, who could rush to the hotel ballroom and save the deal. But even if someone agreed, it would take at least an hour. An hour was too long. Millions could be lost in minutes. The sound of murmuring grew louder. The investors spoke quickly among themselves, their tone edged with disdain. Marcus, wiping a smudge from the far corner of the room, understood every word. He heard them say the CEO was unprepared, careless, disrespectful of their time. He heard the disappointment bleeding into insult. Marcus's chest tightened with the weight of words that no one else in the room could catch. His mop slowed across the floor, his body still but his mind racing. He knew exactly what was being said. He knew how to bridge the gap with clarity, with nuance, with the dignity the situation demanded. But he also knew he was invisible. The assistants brushed past him, knocking the handle of his mop without so much as an apology. He saw their desperation, the way they whispered frantically into phones, the way they avoided the CEO's glare. Marcus wanted to step forward to speak, but the weight of years of silence pressed down on him. He remembered every time his voice had been dismissed, every interview where his answers were ignored, every look that told him he didn't belong. The question burned in his chest: if he spoke now, would they even listen? Or would they laugh at the idea that the janitor understood more about this moment than anyone else in the room? Marcus's pulse thudded in his ears as the noise of the room swelled around him. His grip tightened on the mop handle until his knuckles ached. He thought of his children, two bright faces waiting at home, always asking why their father seemed tired, always telling him he was the smartest man they knew. He told them every night to speak up, to believe their voices mattered, to never let anyone shrink them down. But standing in that ballroom, surrounded by wealth and power, he felt the weight of hypocrisy pressing against his chest. How could he teach them courage if he let fear silence him now? His father's voice echoed inside him like a drumbeat. "Son, you have to be twice as good to be seen as equal." Those words had followed Marcus his whole life, stitched into his very being. Tonight they pressed harder than ever. He could not be average. He could not be good enough. If he dared to open his mouth, he had to be flawless, undeniable, so precise that not even their prejudice could smother him. He slowly placed the mop against the wall, his hands trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from the enormity of the decision he was about to make. A few assistants brushed by him, muttering in irritation, telling him to clear the way. He ignored them. His legs carried him forward toward the polished table where the CEO sat, his mask of confidence crumbling. Marcus's footsteps were quiet, yet they rang in his own ears like thunder. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice carrying across the room. Heads turned immediately, the chatter cut off. For a heartbeat, the room was utterly still. Eyes locked on him, some with confusion, others with annoyance. The CEO's gaze hardened. "What are you doing here? Clean later." His words sliced with the authority of a man who was used to being obeyed. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry, his heart threatening to pound its way out of his chest. He could already feel the weight of judgment pressing down from every corner. The investors leaned forward, curious, their faces unreadable. The staff looked shocked, some even whispering under their breath. But Marcus stood firm. He parted his lips, and with a calmness that belied his shaking hands, he spoke in Mandarin. The words flowed effortlessly, his tone respectful, his pronunciation flawless. In an instant, every doubt, every dismissal he had endured seemed to collapse into that moment as the room inhaled sharply at the sound. At first, the CEO blinked in disbelief, as if his ears were deceiving him. His janitor, the man he had passed 1,000 times without a second glance, was speaking with a fluency he couldn't comprehend. The investors' faces, tight with frustration moments ago, softened into surprise. Their eyes lit up with recognition as Marcus translated each word with careful precision. The sharp edges of their tone dissolved as understanding returned to the table. They leaned in, intrigued now, no longer offended. Marcus didn't stumble. His cadence was natural, his vocabulary precise, his inflection respectful. He didn't just recite words, he captured meaning. He mirrored the politeness embedded in their language, the subtleties that showed humility and regard. Every phrase he conveyed carried the cultural weight that the CEO's broken sentences could never have achieved. The investors nodded, their postures easing, their trust repairing itself moment by moment. For the first time that night, the conversation resembled a dialogue rather than a disaster. The CEO sat rigid in his chair, torn between relief and humiliation. His empire was being rescued. Yet not by his assistants, not by the professionals he surrounded himself with, but by the man he had always ignored. Beads of sweat clung to his forehead as he forced a smile, pretending to have orchestrated the turnaround. Deep down, though, he knew the truth. His entire future balance sheet now depended on the man in a janitor's uniform. The assistants, who had moments earlier brushed past Marcus without thought, exchanged stunned glances. Some gawked, their mouths slightly open, unable to reconcile the image of the mop against the wall with the flawless Mandarin flowing from his lips. Others shifted uneasily, their shame reflected in their silence. The hierarchy of the room, so rigid before, was quietly unraveling. As the discussion continued, Marcus adjusted effortlessly, weaving through complex financial terminology, subtle negotiations, and cultural idioms that carried significance beyond mere numbers. He listened intently to both sides, ensuring clarity, ensuring no meaning was lost in translation. The investors began to smile, their pens scratching across papers as contracts were reviewed again with renewed optimism. One of them even laughed softly at a small joke Marcus carried across the table, and the tension that had choked the room for so long finally lifted. The atmosphere transformed from confrontation to cooperation, not through power or wealth, but through the unacknowledged brilliance of the man they had all overlooked. The meeting drew to a close with the investors offering firm handshakes and genuine gratitude. Their words were directed not to the CEO but to Marcus. In their eyes, he was no longer the man sweeping floors. He was the bridge that made dialogue possible, the reason the deal was signed. They spoke to him directly in Mandarin, and he responded with ease, leaving them nodding with respect. The room that had once seen him as invisible now watched him as though he had always belonged at the table. The CEO forced himself into the spotlight, thanking the investors with exaggerated gestures, his smile stretched too wide, his voice strained. Yet his eyes betrayed something else entirely, a flicker of unease, even fear. He had built an empire on the belief that he controlled every variable. That power belonged to him alone. But tonight, the fragile illusion cracked. The man he had dismissed daily, the one he paid barely enough to survive, had held more influence in that moment than his entire board of directors combined. The applause in the room was not for him. It was for the janitor. Staff members who had once ignored Marcus shifted awkwardly near the walls, their faces caught between awe and shame. Some offered hesitant smiles, others clapped a little too late, trying to hide the realization that they had never once asked who he truly was. A few assistants avoided his eyes altogether, unable to reconcile their earlier dismissal of him with the reality unfolding in front of them. The hierarchy they had relied on so comfortably had been shaken, exposed for its arrogance. Marcus, however, did not bask in their sudden recognition. When the papers were signed and the investors prepared to leave, he quietly stepped back. Retrieving the mop, he had leaned against the wall. His shoulders straightened, not from pride but from an inner calm that had always been there. The uniform on his back didn't define him. The silence they had forced on him all those years hadn't erased his knowledge, his skill, or his worth. He had never been less. They had simply never cared enough to see. The investors departed with gratitude still lingering in their words, while the CEO stood awkwardly at the center of the room, smiling through clenched teeth, caught between the image of success and the sting of humiliation. The chandelier's glow reflected across the marble floors. Marcus would return to polishing, though nothing in that room looked the same anymore. The chandelier still glowed. The contract still signed. The CEO still rich. But the real story that night wasn't the billions saved. It was the moment the invisible man forced the world to see him. Racism and discrimination thrive on blindness, on the arrogance of assuming worth by uniform, accent, or skin. Marcus shattered that blindness with truth, courage, and skill. Yet his story isn't rare. All across the world, there are janitors hiding brilliance, maids holding PhDs, drivers carrying wisdom the world ignores. Because opportunity doesn't always knock equally. It sometimes walks right past. The question is, will we keep pretending not to see? Or will we finally recognize the humanity, the dignity, the genius in every person, no matter their job, their race, their place in society? Tonight, Marcus proved one thing: the mop may have been in his hands, but power was always in his voice.